It was a hot afternoon in Atlanta, and FBI Special Agent Tara Johnson, a smart and well-respected black woman, was driving back to her office after a long, hard day of work. She had been working on a high-profile case for months, trying to find a dangerous drug cartel, and she was almost there. Even though she was tired from the long hours and stress, Tara felt proud of her work. It wasn't easy being one of the few black women in a mostly white male-dominated field. As she drove through the city, her mind was racing with details of the case. She was going over the latest intelligence in her head when all of a sudden, flashing blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror. She looked down at the speedometer and saw that she wasn't going too fast. Confused, she pulled over to the side of the road and thought about what she could have done wrong. A police car pulled up behind her, and a tall white officer with a stern face stepped out, resting his hand on the glass. Holster for his gun, Tara rolled down her window and calmly reached for her FBI badge, ready to explain who she was. "Good afternoon, officer," she asked politely. "Is there a problem?" Officer Daniels barely looked at her license and registration before barking and not bothering to greet her. Tara was surprised by his tone, but she stayed professional and said, "I'm an FBI agent." Officer Daniels barely glanced at it before frowning. "License and..." Tara's heart skipped a beat. Something wasn't right. She had dealt with difficult police officers before, but Daniels was different. His cold, dismissive attitude toward her authority as a federal agent sent a chill down her spine. "Officer, I'm a federal agent. I'm on official duty," she said again and again, trying to keep her cool. Daniels narrowed his eyes and ignored her completely. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered sharply. Tara stared at him in shock. Daniels' voice raised, drawing the attention of people nearby. "Excuse me, are you deaf?" he asked, motioning for Tara to get out of the car. She hesitated. She knew her rights and that this wasn't right. She hadn't been pulled over, let alone asked to get out of the car. But the situation was quickly getting out of hand. She had been trained to deal with high-stress situations, but this felt different. The tension was high, and the racial undertones were impossible to ignore. "Officer, I'm following your request, but I need..." Daniels reached out and leaned closer to her window, saying, "I don't care if you're the president. Step out of the car, or I'll drag you out myself." This made Tara feel sick to her stomach, so she slowly opened her car door and got out, making sure her hands were always visible. People walking by started to whisper, but no one spoke up. Daniels moved toward her, and before she could say another word, he grabbed her. He grabbed her by the arm and pushed her against the car. "Hey, what are you doing?" Tara asked, her voice filled with anger and shock. "Resisting arrest?" Daniel laughed as he twisted her arm behind her back. "You think you can just flash a badge and do whatever you want, don't you?" Tara winced as the handcuffs were put on her wrists. She couldn't believe what was happening. It was humiliating and an abuse of power since she was a federal agent. Tara was being treated like a common criminal because Officer Daniels wouldn't recognize her status. People were staring at her, and some were even recording the scene on their phones. Tara's face burned with anger and shame, but she kept her head held high. She knew she hadn't done anything wrong and wasn't going to let this racist officer break her spirit. "Officer Daniels, you're making a mistake," she said firmly, though her voice was shaking a little from the anger. Daniels snapped, "You think you're better than everyone else because you work for the FBI? Well, let me tell you something, you're not above the law." Tara's mind raced. She had to stay calm and figure out how to get out of this situation without making things worse. Her co-workers at the FBI would never believe her if she told them she was arrested for no reason while on duty. Daniels dragged her toward his patrol car and pushed her into the back seat, ignoring all of her attempts to reason with him. Bystanders were filming and looked shocked, some murmuring in disbelief, but no one stepped forward to help or question the officer's actions. As the door slammed shut, Tara took a deep breath. She had been through many tough situations in her career, but this felt different. It felt personal. Daniels had crossed a line, and she knew she couldn't let him get away with it. Her mind started working quickly to figure out what she should do next. Would she call for help? Would she file a formal complaint? She couldn't lose her temper right now, but she also couldn't let this injustice go unanswered. As the police car pulled away from the curb, Tara's mind raced. This wasn't over yet. As she sat in the back of the police car, her wrists hurt from the tight handcuffs and the cold metal biting into her skin, she looked out the window and watched the city streets blur by. Her mind was racing. This wasn't just an ordinary arrest, this was something much deeper. Officer Daniels clearly had a personal feeling. The man had a vendetta against her, but why? Was it because she was black? Or did he think he could abuse his power over her without getting in trouble? It didn't matter now. What mattered was how she would handle this. As they drove, Tara tried to stay calm. She had been taught to do so, but this situation required all of her self-control. Her first thought was to grab her phone and call her boss, but she couldn't because her hands were cuffed. She thought about asking Daniels to loosen the cuffs behind his back, but she didn't think he'd even think about it because of the way he looked at her in the rearview mirror. He said with a smug grin, "You really thought you could get away with pretending to be FBI, didn't you?" Tara's eyes narrowed. "I'm not pretending I am a federal agent, and you're making a huge mistake." He laughed and shook his head. "Sure you are, and I'm the chief of police," he said in a mocking tone. She didn't say anything because she knew arguing with him wasn't going to work. The car stopped in front of a small police station on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't the usual precinct she was used to, it looked like an older, less used station. S's stomach sank when she realized this wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. Daniels had taken her somewhere away from the main precinct, probably to avoid any attention from higher-ups or her co-workers at the FBI. He got out of the car and opened the back door, grabbing her arm roughly as he pulled her out. "Let it go," he sneered, emphasizing the word agent as if it were a joke. Tara winced as he pushed her toward the entrance of the station. She knew she had to stay calm, but the shame and anger were building up inside her. She had been through a lot in her career, but nothing had prepared her for this kind of blatant disrespect. It wasn't just about being arrested, it was about being seen as less important. Because of her skin color, gender, or position in the station. It was eerily quiet, and the few officers who were there barely looked up as Daniels led her past the front desk. Tara noticed that they didn't react, as if Daniels' behavior like this was normal or even expected. It was a chilling realization that no one would help her, she was on her own. Daniels pushed her into a small interrogation room and slammed the door shut behind them. The room was dimly lit and had only a small metal table and 2 chairs. Despite still having her handcuffs on, he paced back and forth in front of her, saying, "I don't care who you say you are. As far as I'm concerned, you're just another criminal trying to pull a fast one." Carrera glared at him, refusing to be scared. "You're violating my rights, you have no reason to hold me, and when this is over, you'll regret it." Daniel stopped pacing and leaned in close to her, placing his face against hers. "Is that a threat, agent?" he asked in a low voice. He looked at her for a moment and then laughed angrily. "You really think you're untouchable, don't you? Flash that badge like it means something. Well, let me tell you something, you're in my territory now." Tara could feel the tension in the air, but she met his gaze without moving. "I dealt with bigger threats than you, Officer Daniels. You won't get away with this," she said. "We'll see about that." Daniel straightened up and walked out of the room. As he left, the door shut behind him. Tara slowly let out a breath. She needed to find a way to get in touch with her team. No one in the station could help her, and she was sure that Daniels would do everything he could to keep her alone. Her mind raced with all the things she could do to get out of this mess and make things better. She looked around the room for anything that could help. There was a small window near the ceiling, but it was too high to reach, and the door was locked. The only thing she had with her was her badge, which she still had in her jacket pocket but couldn't reach because her hands were cuffed. Tara became more and more angry because she wasn't used to being in this situation. She was used to being in charge and making arrests, not the other way around. The power dynamic in this room was very different, and she had to figure out a way to get back on top. Suddenly, the door swung open, and another officer walked in. A younger man, maybe in his early 30s, walked into the room with a nervous look on his face. He seemed less sure of himself and less aggressive than Daniels. He looked at her and then at the file in his hand before speaking to Agent Johnson. He began cautiously, "Hi, my name is Officer Mitchell. I was told to process you for holding, but I just want to say I'm sorry about all this." Terrera looked at him in surprise. His voice didn't sound hostile like Daniels's, which made her think that he might be an ally. Before she could answer, Daniels came in and took the file away. Appeared in the doorway and glared at Mitchell. "What are you waiting for? Get her processed," he snapped, his eyes burning with anger. Mitchell hesitated, his discomfort clear, but he reluctantly nodded, "Yes, sir." Daniels lingered for a moment longer, his gaze shifting between Tara and Mitchell before turning and leaving the room again. Tara looked into Mitchell's eyes and thought he might be the key to getting her out of this situation. She watched Officer Mitchell with a mix of hope and caution. She wasn't sure if he was uneasy or even sympathetic, but she knew that people in his position often gave up when things got tough, especially when they were under the pressure of someone like Daniels. Still, she couldn't let any possible chat slip through her fingers. Mitchell cleared his throat awkwardly as he pulled a small notebook out of his pocket. "I'm going to need some information," he said, his voice a little shaky. "It's just routine name, date of birth, that kind of thing." Tara looked at him closely, his reluctance was clear in. His eyes kept darting to the door as if he thought Daniels would burst in at any moment. "You already know who I am," she said in a calm but firm voice. "What you're doing here is a right, and you know it." Mitchell's hand stopped scribbling, and for a split second, they looked at each other. There was a flicker of something in his gaze that might have been guilt, but it was quickly covered up by a forced sense of duty. He looked back down at his notepad to avoid her gaze. "I don't make the rules," he said under his breath. "Low and steady," she said. "You might not make the rules, but you can choose whether or not to follow orders that you know are wrong." Mitchell hesitated again, his pen shaking in his hand. The small interrogation room was tense, and it was clear that he was struggling on the inside. Tara could see the conflict on his face. She had been in enough high-stress situations to know how to tell when someone was struggling with their conscience. "I can help you, Mitchell," she said, her tone softening. "But you have to help me first." He sighed deeply and ran his hand through his hair. "This isn't how things are supposed to go," he said almost to himself. "I know something is wrong, but Daniels is the senior officer. I can't just understand Daniels is abusing his power." Tara spoke up, her voice sharp but controlled. "You've seen it, you know it, and if you don't do something about it now, you're just as responsible." Mitchell shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The weight of her words hung in the air, and he looked around. As he opened his mouth to speak, the door to the interrogation room flew open, and Daniel rushed in. Daniel's face was red with anger, and he yelled at Mitchell, "What's taking so long? She's a simple case, not a puzzle to solve." Mitchell jumped up from his chair, stuttered a little, and said, "I was just getting the basic information." Sir Daniel scowled at him, clearly not impressed. "Get her into holding already, we don't have all day," Mitchell replied. "Okay," he said, quickly putting his notepad back into his pocket and avoiding Tara's gaze. Stood up and motioned for her to follow him, but Tara wasn't done. She knew this could be her only chance to talk to him, and she wasn't going to let fear stop her. "Officer Daniels, you're making a mistake," Tara said in a steady, authoritative voice. "This is going to come back on you, I guarantee it." Daniels laughed out loud, making a harsh, bitter sound that echoed off the walls. "Oh, I'm sure you think so, sweetheart, but in this town, nobody cares about your so-called authority. You think that just because you have a fancy FBI badge makes you..." Tara refused to back down, saying, "I'm not here to impress you, Daniels. I'm here to do my job, and trust me, the people with due care will be coming for you." For a moment, Daniel's eyes showed a brief flash of doubt, but it was quickly replaced by his usual smug arrogance. He waved his hand at Mitchell and said, "Get her out of my sight." Mitchell, clearly scared, stepped forward and grabbed Terrera by the arm, leading her out of the room and down a flight of stairs. They walked down a narrow hallway with a lot of tension between them. Tara could tell Mitchell was still processing what had happened, but he didn't say anything. When they got to a small holding cell at the end of the hallway, Mitchell unlocked the door and motioned for her to enter. Tara looked at him directly for a moment and said quietly, "You still have a choice. You don't have to go along with this." Mitchell slouched his shoulders and muttered something under his breath. Without saying a word, he shut the cell door behind her and walked away. Tara sat on the small, cold bench inside the cell and took a deep breath. The walls felt like they were closing in on her, but she forced herself to stay calm. She knew she had to stay level-headed if she was going to get out of this situation. Panicking wouldn't help her now. As she sat there alone with her thoughts, the hours seemed to go by, and each minute only made her more frustrated and angry. She wasn't just fighting for her freedom, she was also fighting against the injustice that had brought her here in the first place. The racism, the abuse of power, and the humiliation burned in her chest like a fire she couldn't put out. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, and to her surprise, it wasn't Daniels at the door of her cell, but Mitchell. He looked around nervously to see if anyone else was nearby, then quickly opened the door. Tara's heart raced as she heard the knock. "What are you doing?" she whispered, her eyes wide with confusion. Mitchell looked over his shoulder, his face pale with worry. "I'm getting you out of here, but we don't have much time." Tara hesitated for a moment, not sure if she should trust him, but she knew she had to if there was even a small chance that he was telling the truth. She followed him out of the cell and down the hallway, quickly moving through the dimly lit station, avoiding the main entrance. As they got closer to the back exit, Tara's heart was racing. Mitchell stopped, took out a set of keys, and unlocked the door. "This is your chance," he said quietly, looking at her with a mix of fear and resolve. "Get out of here before Daniels catches on." Tara didn't have time to think it through. She stood frozen by the back exit, the cold night air creeping in through the small gap as Mitchell held her hands. The door open, her mind was racing with questions about whether she could really trust him. The whole situation had been a nightmare, and she didn't think anyone in that precinct would actually help her after everything she had been through. Mitchell nervously looked at his watch and said in a low voice, "We don't have much time." His anxiety was clear, and he kept looking around like he thought Daniels would show up at any moment. Tara took a deep breath. She knew she couldn't stay there, especially after what Daniels had done, but running would only make things worse. She was an FBI agent, so leaving a police station would bring up too many questions. She was stuck between a rock and a hard place. The system she had worked for and trusted had betrayed her, and now she had to make a quick decision. "Why are you doing this?" she asked in a low but firm voice. Mitchell hesitated. He opened his mouth to answer, but quickly closed it again, looking confused. His eyes flickered with guilt and desperation, because it was wrong. He finally muttered, "What is Daniels doing? He's going to pay for it somehow, but right now, if you stay, you're going to be the one who suffers. You need to leave before it's too late." Tara stared at him, trying to figure out if he was telling the truth. The way he spoke and looked at her made her feel like he was begging her to believe him, but she couldn't. Was he really trying to help, or was he just looking for a way to get out of trouble? She couldn't shake the feeling that something still didn't add up. She didn't have time to think about it, because time was running out. If Mitchell was telling the truth, staying there would make things worse. If Daniels came back and saw her still locked up, he would do whatever he wanted. AA knew better than to underestimate a man like him, who was driven by hate and power. Taking a leap of faith, she nodded and walked toward the door. "All right," she whispered, "let go." Mitchell's face softened in relief, and he quickly led her outside. The cool night air hit her face. For the first time in hours, she felt a glimmer of hope. They moved quietly, staying close to the shadows as they made their way through the back alley behind the precinct. Tara's senses were on high alert. Every rustle of the wind and distant sound of footsteps set her heart racing. She was trained for situations like this, but it was different when the threat came from the police. It was scary to know that Daniels could catch up to them at any time. Mitchell led her to a small, beat-up car. Parked near the end of the alley, He fiddled with his keys for a second before unlocking the passenger door and whispering, "Get in." Tara slid into the seat, her eyes scanning the area for any sign of danger. Mitchell jumped in on the driver's side and started the engine, the low rumble of the car resonating in the quiet night as they pulled away from the precinct. Neither of them spoke for several minutes, and Tara couldn't shake the feeling of unease that was building in her gut. Daniels would have let this go. He was the type of person who liked being in charge, and losing it would only make him more dangerous. Finally, Tara broke the silence and asked, "Where are we going?" Mitchell kept his eyes on the road and gripped the steering wheel tightly. "I'm taking you somewhere safe," he said, "somewhere Daniels won't find you." Tara raised an eyebrow, her doubts returning. "Then I can't just run, I need to deal with this," Mitchell said with a tense look. "I know, but you need time to. If you stay here, Daniels will bury you before you even get the chance." Tara leaned back in her seat, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. She didn't want to run, but Mitchell was right. She needed more information, something concrete that would show Danielle's corruption. But where would she start? And how could she trust anyone in that precinct after what had happened? The car sped down the empty streets, the city lights flickering past them quickly. Stared out the window, her mind working overtime. She needed to call her FBI team, but Daniels had taken her phone back at the precinct. She clenched her fists in anger. It was one thing after another. "Mitchell," she said suddenly, "we need to stop. I need a phone." Mitchell hesitated, his eyes darting nervously to the rearview mirror. "We can't stop yet. It's too risky." Tara clenched her jaw. "I can't do this without talking to my people. If we're going to take Daniels down, I can't be working in the..." After a moment of silence, Mitchell gave in and said, "There's a gas station a few miles up. We'll stop there, you can make your call, but we have to be quick because Daniels is on to us, we don't have much time." Tara agreed, and her mind was already making up who she would call first. She knew exactly who to call, a co-worker who owed her a favor, someone she could trust to act quickly and quietly. As they got closer to the gas station, Mitchell pulled into the dimly lit lot and parked near the side. Looking around made her more careful than usual, but now more than ever, she couldn't afford to make a mistake. She got out of the car and scanned the empty lot as she walked toward the payphone. Mitchell stayed in the car and kept an eye on what was going on around him. Tara picked up the phone and quickly dialed the number she had memorized, praying that her co-worker would answer. The phone rang twice, and finally someone answered. "Tara, is that you?" As soon as her co-worker's voice came over the phone, she felt relieved, but she knew that time was running out and Daniels was getting closer. "Yes, it's me," she whispered. "I'm in trouble, and I need your help. Daniels is dirty. He arrested me for no reason, and now he's trying to cover his tracks." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Tara could hear her co-worker, Agent Jack's son, take a deep breath and say, "All right, calm down. Right now, I'm outside of a gas station on the outskirts of town. Mitchell helped me get away, but I don't know how long we have before Daniels finds out I'm gone. He's dangerous, Jackson, and we need to move quickly." Jackson's voice got serious. "Okay, listen, we'll send backup, but you need to stay low until we get to you." Tara looked over at Mitchell, who was nervously tapping his fingers on the steering wheel and looking around the dark parking lot. "Do you trust this Mitchell guy?" Mitchell asked. Jackson sighed and said, "Okay, I'll pull some strings and get a team to your location, but you need to keep your head down. Daniels will go down without a fight, and if he finds out you're working against him, things could get ugly." Tara nodded, even though Jackson couldn't see her. "I understand. I'll keep moving until you send backup. Don't let me down, Jackson. You know I won't stay safe." The line went dead, and Tara hung up the phone. Her mind was racing, and she felt a rush of. Determined, she wasn't out of the woods yet, but at least she had a plan. Help was on the way, and with Jackson's help, they could finally bring Daniels down. Tara hurried back to the car and slid into the passenger seat. Mitchell looked at her with concern and asked, "Is everything okay?" Tara replied, "I made the call to send help, but we can't stay here because Daniels will be looking for us, and it won't take him long to figure out I'm gone." Mitchell nodded and put the car into gear, letting off the gas station and back on the road. It seemed darker now, and the streets were eerily empty as they sped through the city. Tara kept her eyes on the side mirrors, looking for any signs of a pursuit, but so far, it looked like they were safe. As the minutes went by, the tension between them grew. Tara couldn't help but think about what had happened that night. From the moment she met Daniels for the first time, to the way he looked at her and the sneer on his face as he handcuffed her, everything had been a blur. She couldn't believe someone like him was in charge. She looked at Mitchell, who hadn't said a word since they left the gas station. He looked tired, with a pale face cast against the dim light of the dashboard. It was clear that helping her had cost him something, maybe his loyalty to Daniels or his sense of safety, but he chose to side with her anyway, which gave her a glimmer of hope. "You didn't have to do this," Tara said softly, breaking the silence. Mitchell let out a sigh. Daniels has been dishonest for years, but no one has ever been brave enough to stand up to him. He has the whole precinct under control, and I knew that if I didn't do something, you'd be the one to pay for his mess. Tara looked at him for a moment, her eyes getting a little narrower, and she asked, "Why did you decide to help me?" Mitchell hesitated, his eyes moving to the road ahead. "I've seen what happens to people who don't follow the rules. I've seen what he does to people who get in his way. And you weren't just another person he could push around, you're an FBI agent. If he took you down, it would show everyone else that no one is safe from him, and I couldn't let that happen." Tara slowly nodded, realizing that Daniels wasn't just trying to make fun of her, he was trying to show everyone that even someone with her authority and power could be broken under his rule. Wasn't the type to give up, she had spent her whole career fighting for justice, and she wasn't going to let a racist, power-hungry cock like Daniel take that away from her. She would see this through no matter what. As they drove in silence, the city's edges slowly gave way to more rural areas. The streets got narrower and fewer lights appeared. Mitchell had probably taken them away from the main roads to avoid being seen, but Tara knew it wouldn't be long before Daniels figured out who they were. He would soon have the whole precinct looking for them. After what seemed like forever, Mitchell pulled into a small, remote parking lot near the edge of a dense forest. The area was empty, except for a few buildings in the distance. He turned to Tara, his face grim, and said quietly, "We'll wait here until your team arrives. It's out of the way, and Daniels won't think to look here, at least not right away." Tara looked around the empty lot, her instincts telling her to stay on high alert. The eerie silence made them feel even more uneasy, but for now this was the best choice they had. She nodded and leaned back in her seat, her mind still racing with thoughts of what was to come. They were safe for now, but the danger wasn't over yet. Daniels wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted, so they had to stay one step ahead of him. Mitchell shifted in his seat and nervously looked out into the dark woods around them. "We should stay quiet if anyone's following us." Tara agreed that they had come too far to risk being caught now. As they sat in the car, the minutes seemed to turn into hours. Outside, the sounds of the wind blowing leaves and the distant hum of traffic were amplified by the stillness of the night. Tara's mind wandered to what she would do next when Jackson's team arrived. She couldn't just run and hide forever, she had to do something to make sure Daniels was held responsible for everything he had done, but she would need a solid plan. Tara's mind was racing as she and Mitchell sat in the dark, isolated parking lot. The only sound was the occasional creak of branches swaying in the wind. The dashboard's faint glow lit up their tense faces, and each minute felt heavier than the last. Mitchell kept nervously looking around, his eyes darting from the rearview mirror to the side windows, scanning for any sign of approaching danger. Tara could understand why he was nervous. They were both running away from a man with unchecked power who would do anything to keep his secret safe. "I'm still trying to wrap my head around all of this," Mitchell said, breaking the silence. "Daniels has always been a snake, but I didn't think he'd take it this far." Tara turned to him and said, "He's more than just a snake." Mitchell would make sure Daniels knew his time was running out. Gave a nod but still seemed doubtful. "I get that you want to bring him down, but he has the whole department sucked up in fear. Most of them are too afraid to speak out because they know what will happen to anyone who crosses him. Putting fear aside, she knew how Daniels made people feel because she had seen him carry himself like he owned the place. But this wasn't just about fear, it was about justice. Daniels had gone too far, and now he was going after her to hide his tracks. She wouldn't let him get away with it. What we need is solid evidence, Tara said out loud. We need something that can't be argued with that proves he's been abusing his power. Mitchell frowned and looked unsure. It would be hard to go after Daniels, because he's not careless and is good at hiding his tracks. Also, no one in the precinct will help us, because they're afraid of what he'll do if they talk. Tara's mind raced, because she knew Mitchell was right. Going after Daniels wouldn't be easy, because most officers in the department either supported him or were too scared to do anything. She wanted to challenge him, but she also knew there had to be a way to show that Daniels had been dishonest for too long. People like him always made mistakes in the end, it was just a matter of finding the right thread to pull. There's got to be something, she said to herself more than to Mitchell. There's got to be a paper trail, an eyewitness, anything. Mitchell stayed quiet and stared out the windshield. The tension in the car was palpable, and for a moment they were both lost in their thoughts when Tara's phone rang. There was a short message from Jackson on the screen, telling her that backup was on the way and to stay put. This gave her some short-lived relief, because Daniels might be persistent, but so was she. Backup was on the way, but she couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get worse. We just have to stay low until they get here, Tara said in a steady but tense voice. I hope they get here before Daniels does, Mitchell said, still looking tense. Responding, she knew Mitchell was right to be worried that Daniels would have let her escape without a fight. To him, she was a threat that had to be killed, and he wouldn't stop until she was silenced for good. Suddenly, the faint sound of an engine in the distance broke the silence of the night. Mitchell's eyes widened, and he quickly glanced at the side mirror. Hear that? He whispered to Terrera, who tensed up and listened carefully. The sound was getting louder, and her stomach churned with fear. Mitchell leaned forward and squinted into the darkness. I don't like this, he muttered. We're too exposed out here. Tara's heart raced as she tried to see through the darkness. The distant rumble of the engine grew louder, and her mind raced with worst-case scenarios. If Daniels had caught up to them, there was no telling what he would do. We need to move, Mitchell said, pressing the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and Tara's heart pounded in her chest. Mitchell slammed on the gas, and the car sped forward, tearing out of the parking lot and onto the narrow road. Tara looked over her shoulder, scanning the darkness for any signs of pursuit. She clenched her fists and silently prayed that help would arrive soon as they sped down the empty road. Tara's mind raced, she couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get out of hand. Daniels was closing in, and it felt like they were running out of time. Mitchell swerved onto a side road, the car bumping along the uneven pavement. They were now well into the rural outskirts, surrounded by thick woods and silence. Tara's eyes darted back and forth between the rearview mirror and the dark road ahead, looking for any sign of danger. Are you sure this is a good idea? She asked, her voice tense with worry. We're going into the middle of nowhere. Mitchell shook his head and gripped the steering wheel tightly. It's better than waiting around for Daniels to find us at least, he said. Tara wasn't sure, but she knew they didn't have many choices. They had to buy time until Jackson's team arrived, and they had to keep moving to avoid being cornered by Daniels. As they drove deeper into the woods, the narrow road became even more dangerous. The car bounced and jolted over potholes and cracks in the pavement, and Tara clung to the door to try to stay steady. Suddenly, the sound of another car engine echoed through the night, and Tara's heart skipped a beat. She looked at Mitchell with wide eyes and whispered, "He's found us." Mitchell's face turned pale, and he slammed on the gas harder, speeding up the car as they raced down the dark road. Tara's heart was pounding as she saw the headlights of a car coming up behind them, getting closer by the second. "Pull on," Mitchell muttered, his voice tense with fear. He swerved the car onto an even smaller road that was barely wide enough for one car. The headlights behind them were closing in, and she knew they were running. Out of options, the car swerved violently as they sped down the narrow road. Tara's heart raced as she clung to her seat and prayed they could get away from whoever was chasing them. Mitchell's grip tightened on the wheel as the narrow road wound through the dense forest. The headlights from the car behind them lit up the trees, casting long, eerie shadows across their path. Tara's heart raced as the car bounced over uneven ground, its tires barely gripping the worn-out pavement. Mitchell muttered under his breath, "That is, they're not giving up." Tara looked in the side mirror and felt her heart race as the car behind them got closer. The bright headlights seemed to cut through the darkness and threatened to swallow them whole. She couldn't see who was driving, but she didn't need to. It could only be one person, Daniels. Relentless, Tara said through clenched teeth, her eyes darting between the rearview mirror and the road ahead. "We can't let him catch us now." Mitchell grimaced and pushed the car even harder. The engine moaned in protest as they tore through the winding road, the tires squealing as they rounded each sharp turn. The trees on either side of the road seemed to get closer, and the road seemed to get narrower with every mile. "We're going to lose him," Mitchell said, but it sounded more like he was trying to convince himself. Tara wasn't so sure. Daniels had already shown that he wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted, and what he wanted was her. She could feel the weight of his obsession. He wasn't just a dishonest police officer, he was a man who thrived on power and control, and she was the only thing standing in his way right now. The road ahead suddenly split into two paths, and Mitchell made a split-second decision to veer sharply to the left. The car swerved to the side, and Tara grabbed the dashboard to steady herself. The headlights behind them flickered for a moment, before appearing back on the same path they had taken. "Damn it," Mitchell cursed under his breath. Tara's mind was racing with ideas for a plan. They couldn't keep avoiding Daniels forever, especially on these back roads. They had to come up with something quickly. "We can't just keep driving," Tara said in a tense voice. "He'll catch us eventually. We need to do something." Mitchell looked at her with his jaw clenched. "What do you suggest we do?" Tara asked. "We're out in the middle of nowhere." She looked at the trees on either side of the road. The trees were thick and dark, and their branches were twisting to join. Even though it wasn't the best place to hide, they had no choice but to pull over. "We'll ditch the car and head into the woods," she said suddenly. Mitchell gave her a skeptical look and asked, "Are you serious?" Tara nodded, her heart racing. "It's our best shot. Daniels won't be able to follow us through the trees, we can lose him." Mitchell hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror as the car behind them got closer. Then, taking a deep breath, he said, "Okay, let's do it." He swerved the car. They skidded to a stop on the side of the road, just as the headlights of the pursuing car shone brightly behind them. Tara didn't waste any time, she threw open the passenger door and jumped out, landing hard on the gravel. Mitchell was right behind her, slamming his door shut as they ran toward the thick line of trees. The forest was dark and scary, but Tara didn't care, they had to get away quickly. The sound of the other car skidding to a stop could be heard throughout the night, and Tara's PSC sped up. They didn't have time. "Much time, come on," she whispered, grabbing Mitchell's arm and pulling him into the shadows of the trees. The thick branches above blocked out what little light there was, leaving them in almost total darkness. The ground beneath their feet was uneven, and the thick underbrush made it hard to move quickly, but Tara didn't slow down. She could hear the sound of a car door slamming in the distance, followed by the sound of Daniel's boots hitting gravel. Mitchell stumbled behind her, trying to keep up. He was having trouble breathing, and Tara could tell he was starting to panic. But they couldn't stop now, they had to keep going, Tara whispered, looking over her shoulder. "If he finds us," she said, but she didn't have to finish the sentence because they both knew what would happen if Daniels caught up to them. They had seen what he could do, and neither of them wanted to go through it again. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and Tara's stomach tightened with fear that Daniel was close. They needed to find a way out, or at least a place to hide. Mitchell whispered, his voice hoarse as he grabbed her arm and pointed to a thicket of bushes up ahead. Tara didn't think twice, she ducked behind the bushes and pulled Mitchell with her. The branches scratched her skin, but she didn't notice because she was focused on the footsteps coming closer, each one sending a wave of fear through her body. As the footsteps got closer, they hunched over and barely dared to breathe. Tara's breath caught in her throat as she prayed that the darkness would be enough to hide them. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps stopped, and the soft rustle of leaves under their boots was the only sound in the still night. Her mind raced. What if Daniels found them? What if he knew exactly where they were hiding? She could feel Mitchell shaking next to her, and she silently prayed that he would stay quiet for what seemed like forever. They stood still, waiting, and then, without warning, steps started moving away from them again, and Tara let out a shaky breath. She felt relief as the footsteps went the other way. Mitchell whispered, and Tara nodded, but her body stayed tense. She knew Daniels wouldn't give up that easily. They weren't safe. "We can't stay here," Tara whispered, scanning the darkness around them. "We need to keep moving." Mitchell hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Together, they carefully stood up and started getting deeper into the woods, their steps barely making a sound on the soft forest floor. The night went on, and with each step they took, Daniel's pursuit hung over them like a storm cloud. Tara knew they couldn't keep running forever, but for now, all they could do was stay one step ahead. Tara and Mitchell trudged deeper into the forest, their breaths short and their bodies tense. The air smelled like damp earth, and the only sounds were the hoot of a bird in the distance. Even though they had gotten away from Daniels for now, Tara couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there waiting for the right time to attack. As they moved farther away from the road, the trees seemed to close in on them. The ground was uneven, with fallen branches and thick underbrush making it hard to walk. Tara's legs hurt, but she forced herself to keep going because they were still being chased. Mitch stumbled next to her. His face was pale in the faint moonlight that got through the trees, and he was breathing heavily. Tara could tell he was having trouble keeping up. She slowed down a bit and looked over at him with concern. "Are you okay?" she whispered in a voice that was hard to hear in the quiet night. Mitchell nodded, though his face was grim. "Yeah, I'm fine. I'm just trying to catch my breath." Tara knew he was tired, but they couldn't stop yet because Daniels was still out there looking for them. She said softly, looking around at the darkness, "We need to find a place to hide until we can come up with a plan." Mitchell didn't argue, he just nodded and kept walking, though his steps were slower and more labored. Tara's mind was racing as they tried to figure out what to do next. They couldn't stay in the forest forever, and they couldn't go back to the road, where Daniels would be waiting, and she was sure he'd be even more determined to catch them. Suddenly, Mitchell stopped in his tracks, his hands on his hips. She quickly reached out and grabbed Tara's arm. She turned to Mitchell with her heart racing and a question in her throat. "What is it?" Mitchell didn't answer right away. Instead, he pointed ahead, his eyes wide with fear. Tara followed his gaze, squinting into the darkness. At first, she didn't see anything, but as her eyes got used to the faint moonlight, she saw the outline of a building in the distance. It was an old cabin, with dark windows and a slightly sagging roof. The building had been empty for years, but it provided temporary shelter, which was all they needed right now. "Come on," Tara said quietly, pulling Mitchell's arm, "let's check it out." They walked slowly toward the cabin, their steps almost silent on the forest floor as they got closer. Tara couldn't shake the unease that settled in her chest. The cabin looked empty, but she knew better than to let down her guard. Daniels was still out there, and the last thing they needed was to walk into a trap. When Tara carefully opened the door, it made a loud creaking sound that echoed through the quiet night. She winced, but quickly pushed the door open wider, motioning for Mitchell to follow her inside. The inside of the cabin was just as run down as the outside. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs hummed from the ceiling's quarters. What little furniture there was old and worn, and the wood was splintered and cracked from years of neglect. A musty smell filled the air, and the floor sagged under their feet as they walked on it. Walked in and shut the door behind them. Tara looked around the room for anything they could use. There wasn't much, just a few broken chairs and a table that looked like it could fall over at any time, but at least they were surrounded by walls, which gave them some protection. "We can stay here for a bit," Tara said, though she wasn't sure she agreed, "until we figure out what to do next." Mitchell agreed and sat down on one of the broken chairs. He wiped his forehead. Mitchell looked around the room with his face wet with sweat and said, "This place gives me the creeps." Tara agreed, but she couldn't get rid of the feeling that they weren't alone. The cabin felt too still and quiet. Her instincts told her to be on guard, but she didn't want to scare Mitchell. They were already on edge, and the last thing they needed was for fear to take over. "We'll be fine," she said, trying to sound more sure of herself than she really felt. "We just need to rest for a bit." Mitchell nodded again, but he didn't look completely sure. Tara couldn't blame him. Everything about this situation was wrong, and it seemed like they were always one step behind. Tara moved toward one of the windows and carefully pulled back the frayed curtain just enough to look outside. The forest stretched out in front of them, dark and foreboding. She couldn't see Daniels, but that didn't mean he wasn't there. They would have to leave soon, she thought to herself. "We can't stay here for much longer," Mitchell told her. He looked up at her, tired but determined. "What's the plan?" "We can't just keep running forever," she said. "I don't know yet, but we can't go back to the road. Daniels will be waiting for us." Mitchell frowned. "What if we try to reach the nearest town? There has to be one nearby." Tara shook her head. "It's too dangerous if Daniels finds us before we get there. We're done for." As they both thought about what to do next, Tara's mind raced with ideas, but nothing seemed right. Every option felt dangerous, and the thought of confronting Daniels again made her stomach turn. Suddenly, the sound of a branch breaking outside broke the silence, and Tara's heart leaped into her throat. She looked at Mitchell with fear in her eyes, her pulse racing. "Did you hear that?" Mitchell whispered, his voice barely audible. Tara nodded, her body stiffening as she strained to listen. It was the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps echoed through the trees outside the cabin. Daniels was there. Tara pressed her back against the cabin wall and strained to hear the footsteps outside. Each sound sent a jolt of fear through her, tightening her chest. She motioned for Mitchell to keep quiet by putting her finger to her lips. His eyes were wide with fear, but he nodded, understanding how important it was. The footsteps got louder and more deliberate. Whoever was outside wasn't trying to hide, it was as if they knew. Daniels knew exactly where Tara and Mitchell were and was taking his time getting to them. Tara's mind was racing with what he would do if he found them. He had already made it clear that he wouldn't hesitate to use force, and there was no telling how far he'd go to protect himself. Now Tara's hand went instinctively to her waistband, where her FBI-issued gun was hidden. She had almost forgotten about it in the chaos of their escape. She didn't want to use it, but if it came down to protecting herself, she would. The sound of footsteps stopped just outside the cabin door, and Tara held her breath and tensed her body as she waited for the next move. A few painful moments of silence followed, and then there was a loud bang as the door swung open and crashed against the wall with such force that it changed the shape of the whole cabin. As Tara and Mitchell leaned against the wall to hide, she could hear the sound of heavy boots stepping inside slowly but purposefully, and her heart raced every time she heard them. There was no way for her to escape, they were trapped. Teresa Mitchell's voice was barely a whisper, and her face was pale with fear. "What do we do?" Tara asked. She shook her head and tightened her grip on her gun. "Stay quiet," she yelled, "don't move." The FF in the doorway stood for a moment, surveying the room. Tara could hear his shallow breathing and knew right away that it was Daniels. She had heard his voice and seen his face enough times to know it was him. But why was he moving so slowly? Daniels teased them, come out wherever you are." His voice was cruel, and it was Agent Lawson. Tara got a chill at the sound of his voice. He knew she was there, so there was no point in hiding any longer. She slowly walked toward the corner, her back still against the wall and her gun drawn but hidden behind her. She had to stay calm and smart. Mitchell's breathing got heavier, and Tara could feel his panic rising. She looked at him and told him, A reassuring hand on his arm told him they had to stay strong and not let their fear take over. Daniels took another step into the cabin, scanning the room with his flashlight beam. "You thought you could run from me," he said with a sneer. "You thought you could get away after what you did." Tara's mind was racing with what he was talking about. She had only been doing her job, investigating the case, and now she was being chased like a criminal. "I know you're in here," Daniel said, his voice getting louder. "Why don't you just face your fear and come out? You know this isn't going to end well for you." Tara tightened her grip on her gun. The weight of it in her hand gave her a small sense of control in a situation that felt completely out of her hands. But she had to be careful. One wrong move and things could get worse in a way she couldn't recover from. She peered around the corner just enough to catch a glimpse of Daniels, who was now standing in the middle of the room with his flashlight shining on him. His face was emotionless and cold, as if he were just going through the motions of a routine traffic stop and not on the hunt for a fellow police officer. Tara's mind was racing with options. She could confront him and try to calm things down by using her FBI credentials, but would that work? Daniels didn't seem to care about her authority. In fact, he seemed to enjoy the fact that he had her in this weak position. He had already shown that he didn't respect her as an agent or. Mitchell shifted next to her, and his foot accidentally brushed against a loose floorboard. The sound was small, but it was loud enough to get Daniel's attention. "What was that?" Daniel asked, whipping his head around to find the source of the noise. Tara's heart sank when she realized they had been found. There was no more time to hide, no more time to plan. She had to act now, or things would only get worse. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out from behind the wall, her gun still drawn. Daniels was hiding at her side, and she spoke calmly, even though she was scared. "It's over, you need to stop this." Daniel's eyes widened in surprise for a moment, then his face turned dark. "Tara Lawson," he said in a low, menacing voice, "I knew you'd show yourself eventually." Tara held up her free hand to try to keep things calm. "This doesn't have to go any further, let's just talk," Daniel said. "You think I'm interested in talking after everything you've done?" Daniel scoffed. Daniel sneered and tightened his grip on the baton he was holding. "You think you can just come into my town and start digging into things that don't concern you? You think you can just poke around in my business and walk away?" Tara's eyes narrowed. That was it. This wasn't just a routine stop. Daniels had something to hide, and her investigation had come too close to revealing it. "I was just doing my job," Tara said with a firm voice. "You can't keep running from this sooner, or." Daniel's face was red with anger, and for a moment Tara thought he was going to attack her. But he took a deep breath and his expression turned cold. "Agent Lawson, you don't know what you're dealing with," he said quietly. "But you will soon enough." Before Tara could answer, Daniels lunged at her with his baton raised. She spun around with her gun drawn, but before she could fire, Daniels grabbed her wrist and turned it around. She was hit so hard that the gun fell out of her hand and hit the floor. Mitchell yelled for help and ran to Daniels, but Daniels was too quick. He pushed Tara to the ground and turned to face Mitchell with a deadly look in his eyes. Tara lay on the floor, stunned and weak. The dim light in the cabin flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls as she tried to calm down. Mitchell stood nearby, his hands raised in a futile way to protect himself as Daniels loomed over them. Daniels had taken Tara's gun away, but she still had her training and quick thinking. She knew she had to use both to get out of this alive, so she took a deep breath and forced herself to focus on the task at hand. She couldn't let fear paralyze her. With a sudden burst of energy, Tara rolled away from Daniels, trying to put some distance between them. Her heart was pounding as she scrambled to her feet, her eyes darting around the room for any sign of help. Daniels, temporarily impressed by Tara's toughness, growled, "You're a tough one, aren't you?" This was the end of the conversation. Mitchell's eyes were darting nervously between her and Daniels. He was obviously scared, but he was also trying to figure out how to help. Tara had to act quickly. She couldn't wait for Daniels to make the next move. As Daniels moved toward her, she saw a heavy metal pipe lying in a corner of the cabin. It wasn't ideal, but she quickly grabbed it. In a flash, Daniel lunged at her again, and Tara knocked him back, giving herself a few precious seconds to think. Daniel stumbled, but quickly recovered his composure. "You think a pipe is going to stop me? You've got another thing coming," he said angrily. Despite his bravado, Tara saw a hint of hesitation in Daniel's movements. Maybe he was starting to realize that she wasn't going to be as easy to handle as he thought. She took advantage of this brief moment, her mind racing with plans. "Mitchell, stay back," Terry yelled, her voice full of urgency. "I need you to stay out of this and find help." Mitchell hesitated for a second, clearly torn between staying and running, but seeing the determination in Tara's eyes, he nodded and ran out the door, disappearing into the night. Tara's attention went back to Daniel's. He was still recovering from the blow she had delivered, but his anger seemed to grow with each passing second. If she could make him underestimate her, she might find a way to get the upper hand. When Daniels came back, Tara moved carefully and deliberately. She swung the pipe defensively to keep Daniels away. Her training had taught her how to handle these kinds of situations, but dealing with someone so crazy was a different challenge. "Why are you doing this, Daniels?" Tara demanded, her voice firm despite the adrenaline coursing through her. "What's your endgame?" Daniels snarled. "You think you're so high and mighty, don't you FBI agents? You think you're better than everyone else," he said, and Tara could see the anger in his eyes. This wasn't just a personal vendetta, Daniel had something to hide, and her investigation had touched a nerve. But it was too late to ask why. Tara had to stay focused on the immediate danger. Daniels lunged again, but this time Tarara was ready. Sid stepped in and swung the pipe again, this time hitting Daniels in the arm. Daniels roared in pain. When Daniels stumbled backwards and grabbed his arm, Tarara quickly disarmed him with a well-aimed blow that sent the baton skidding across the floor. Tara moved to grab it, but Daniels wasn't done yet. He lunged at her, his desperation clear. Just as Daniels reached her, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air, giving Tara hope that help was on the way. Daniels's face changed from anger to panic as he realized he didn't have much time left. "You're done, Daniels," Tarara said in a strong voice. "The police are coming." Daniels hesitated, his eyes darting to the door for a moment, making it look like he might try to run away, but then he turned back to Tara, his face filled with anger. "This isn't over," he spat, "you haven't heard the last of me." Before Tara could answer, Daniels ran out the back door of the cabin and disappeared into the darkness. Tarara quickly grabbed the baton and checked to make sure Mitchell was safe. As they got closer, Tara could see flashing lights through the windows. She let out a sigh of relief as the first police cars pulled up, their lights cutting through the cabin's darkness. Officers rushed in, looking worried and determined. Agent Lawson, one of the officers, called out, "Are you okay?" in a voice filled with recognition. Tara nodded, "I'm fine, but we need to find Daniels, he's dangerous and armed." The officers quickly took charge and spread out to look for Daniels while Tara watched. As they moved quickly and carefully, she knew Daniels wouldn't get away. The police were determined and well-equipped, and with Tara's description, they had a good chance of catching him. While the officers worked, Tara thought about Mitchell. He was safe, but the trauma of the night would stay with him. She knew that neither of them would ever forget that night. The cabin, which had been a place of fear and danger, now felt like a safe place. Tara was thankful for the help that had arrived, but she also knew that Daniels was still out there, and the face wasn't closed just yet. Tara took a deep breath and felt a little better. The immediate danger was over, but the fight for justice had just begun. If you like this story, please like and subscribe for part 2. Also, to help build our community, I'd like to know where you are watching from and what time you are watching this video.